Within the Legiones Astartes, many legions have a legacy or role they excel in. Some, like the Dark Angels, pride themselves as the six-legged hexagrammaton, their ability to diversify and annihilate being their greatest strength, while some, like the Luna Wolves / Sons of Horus, were the master of the rapid, precise assault. But one legion has a uniquely, but relatively simple niche, that legion being the Death Guard. The Death Guard as a legion is one that began as something far more than it would become, its downfall starting far before Chaos had even began to have any influence on the legion. The Death Guard were a legion of nuance and tactical fighting men, turned into a sloshing wet mass of dead men marching forward, but being devastating all the same. They began initially as the Dusk Raiders, a legion priding itself more on a mixture of ambush tactics and psychological warfare, rather than the formation tactics it would be known for. They were uniquely effective, as while they could do well in a stand-up fight, they didn't need to, as a reputation preceded them far before their arrival. The crimson and gray of their ceramite plate striking just as much fear into the hearts of any enemy of the Imperium as the 8th, 9th, or 20th legions at the time. This more measured and albeit stealthy approach, one that can honestly be categorized as a blend of the Night Lords pre-Corax Raven Guard and post-Guilliman Ultramarines, was abandoned once their Primarch Mortarion would be found. Mortarion was raised on the world of Barbarous, one that was basically the 40k equivalent of Dagobah, except worse. Here he had been kept basically as the equivalent of a pet/slave by his father 𝐀𝐻, and to say his father had contempt for his son is the understatement of the century. Mortarion would be tested and trained by 𝐀𝐻, but never treated like a son, and eventually would escape captivity and betray his adoptive father. Over the years, Mortarion and his superhuman abilities would organize a resistance against his father, one that was going quite well. Here he would meet many individuals that would travel with him to become Astartes, including Callus Typhon, but not before encountering his true father. The Emperor would descend onto the world and talk with his son. Mortarion knew that this being had to be related to him in some way, but was unsure to what extent. The Emperor would challenge Mortarion to capture the last stronghold of 𝐀𝐻 alone, and that if he failed, he would have to serve him in the Imperium, and if he succeeded, he would be left alone. Mortarion would accept this challenge, and after donning an experimental suit of armor, its design championed and curated by Typhon, Mortarion would climb up the mountain that his father's fortress rested upon. But, upon reaching the top, he would begin to succumb to the elements of toxins and rot that he was so adept at resisting for the first time. Right as 𝐀𝐻 was about to kill Mortarion for his insolence, Emps just walked over and bodied his dad like it was nothing, not only stealing Mortarion's kill, but pledging him to a life of service he did not want. Now with Mortarion swearing fealty to his true father, he would rechristen the 14th as the Death Guard, and would lead them across many campaigns throughout the Great Crusade, but not without controversy. You see, Mortarion is a bit pretentious, kinda lacks self-awareness, or is just delusional and bitter. He sees himself as defying tyranny and liberating many worlds, this strongly being shown in one of the first campaigns the now Death Guard would have against the world of Gillespar. But he would not realize that this now straightforward style of fighting would make many see him as just another brutal tyrant, similar to the ones they were already dealing with. And as such, many of his brothers would keep their distance, as Mortarion was constantly insecure and felt the need to justify himself and his experiences to his brothers, mostly the Khan and Fulgrim, because according to him, he had a much harder life than they did, and for some reason that makes him better at things, I guess? This attitude did not transition to his sons, however, as the Death Guard and Dusk Raiders before them were quite humble, and were happy to take Mortarion's more direct style of grinding attrition warfare, as they found it exhilarating and a true test of their skill. Gone were the fear tactics and stealth, now the Death Guard were there to kill, and that was their greatest strength. They would march forward in formation, bolters in hand, and would annihilate everything in front of them. The already unusually resilient 14th Legion, due to exposure to various injuries and toxins as well as other diseases, being a part of their initiation and their training, something that Mortarion was quite insistent about. And through this, he unwittingly made the toughest legionaries that the galaxy would have ever seen. It just so happens that their strategy is the combat equivalent of a brick, and I mean that in a good way. Their tactics, while simple, worked, and when deployed in zones where that strategy was needed, there was no better option than the Death Guard. It just so happens that you can't approach spreading a galactic empire in the same 2 + 2 = 4 method every time. Mortarion saw everything in extremes, so him and his legion would begin to be relegated and deployed where they worked best, in extreme situations where total decimation of the enemy was required. And this was the status quo for the Death Guard for most of the Great Crusade. But during the Council of Nicaea, Mortarion would rally heavily against the use of Psykers within the Space Marine legions, as himself seeing many warp-spawned abominations on his home planet planet, was not a big fan of psychers or anything warp adjacent, and this would result in him continuing to alienate himself from his brothers over time, but his usefulness would not go unnoticed, as when Horus Lupercal was corrupted and would begin to be under the purview of chaos, the Death Guard would be one of the 4 legions to be involved in the betrayal at Isstvan III, and the Dropsite Massacre at Isstvan V. There, one of his captains, a man named 𝐀𝐦𝐦𝐬𝐢, would use the ship the 𝐌𝐮𝐬𝐢𝐞𝐫 to flee the system, bringing news of Horus's treason to the Imperium, and would go on to be one of 𝐴𝐿CADOR the Sigillite's Knights Errant. But now with the heresy in full swing, it was time for each traitor legion to fall into place. The Death Guard would split itself in half. Typhon, being Mortarion's right-hand man, would take one half of the legion, and Mortarion would take the other. They would attempt to turn Jaghatai Khan to the traitor side, but the Khan, being the wild card he is, saw through Mortarion's ruse and would side with the Loyalists, much to Horus's chagrin, leading to a strong rivalry between the 2 legions for the rest of the war. But towards the tail end of the heresy, as the move on Terra became more and more imminent, Typhon, who was playing around in the background, would make his presence known. Sabotaging the navigators and forcing Mortarion to rely on Typhon to be a ship's navigator, Typhon would lure the legion into a trap, unleashing the Destroyer Plague onto the legion, as Typhon would now be christened Typhus, now the Herald of Nurgle. Nurgle would appear before Mortarion, in a meeting that felt like eternity for the Primarch due to the amount of pain he was in. Nurgle stated quite plainly that if he did not pledge himself and his sons to his patronage like his most trusted ally did, he would let the entire legion rot for all eternity. Seeing no other way to stop the agony of his increasingly resilient sons, he would pledge himself and the Death Guard to Nurgle, Mortarion becoming a demon prince of the Plague God. The Siege of Terra would begin, Mortarion and his legion attacking the throne world in full force. The fighting would be fierce, as the White Scars and Imperial Army troops would fight valiantly against the rotten grime the Death Guard would spew as their undead Astartes hordes would march towards the palace. Even the Khan would not be able to stop Mortarion, fighting the Demon Primarch until he collapsed nearly dead, but surviving nonetheless. They would continue to siege the palace, until the last moment when the battle was deemed lost, where the Legion would then withdraw to the Eye of Terror, entirely intact. The next 10,000 years would be somewhat slow for the Plague Lords. Still eventful, but not as much so as the 9 years the galaxy spent tearing itself apart. Many warbands and elements would do their own thing, Mortarion especially, leading most of the Legion to fall to the purview of Typhus, something he would get far too comfortable doing. The Legion would, however, be essential during the 13th Black Crusade, Typhus and his fleet turning the entire Agrippina sector into slag, as the 𝐀𝐦𝐦𝐸 was smashed much in part due to their efforts. However, that victory was short-lived, as not long after this, the 13th Primarch, the avenging son Roboute Guilliman, would awaken on Macragge, something Mortarion was more than willing to correct. After the launch of the Indomitus Crusade and the bulwark of the Primaris Space Marines were unleashed onto the galaxy, the Death Guard in full force would subvert and attack the entire realm of Ultramar. Worlds would fall, billions would die, as the machinations of both Nurgle and the Legion would pop out of every corner. The sector itself under such constant fire that for it not being part of the larger Indomitus Crusade, the Plague Wars would be considered some of the worst fighting the Imperium had ever seen. The battles of Konor, Ajax, and Parmenio would shake the entire sector to its core, but a miracle would occur during this time. During a duel in the Garden of Nurgle with Mortarion, the near-dead Guilliman would be infused with the power of the Emperor, being able to damage Nurgle's garden using the power of faith that the Imperium had given the savior of mankind the last 10,000 years. Mortarion and his legion would lose, pushed back to the outskirts as the sector would begin to rebuild. The Death Guard and its Marines now are far different from those that came before. What was once a legion of driven but humble men are now merely apathetic. The sloth and rot that many resent are all they are now. There is nothing else of their existence. And while many want to shrug off the chains that were applied to them, like the attitude of simplicity to their warfare provided by their Primarch during their rechristening as the Death Guard, now there's nothing else left. Whether they live or die, nothing matters. And in my reading of 40k lore, I have never seen such a faction of downright nihilistic and empty characters. They just don't care. And while they will spread the gifts of Nurgle, that's all they really have. And the term dead men walking has never been more apt in a context such as this. If you'd like to know more about the Death Guard, please consider reading Flight of the 𝐼𝐚𝐸𝐿𝐴𝐻, 𝐻𝐺, Knight of Grey, the Mortarion Primarch novel, The Buried Dagger, Lords of Silence, the Death Guard Codex from 9th edition, the 13th Black Crusade background book, alongside Codex Eye of Terror if you want to, the Dark Imperium trilogy, Warhawk, and the short story Grandfather's Gifts. All of these are really great and really give you a good idea about the Death Guard as a legion. Thank you all very much for watching. I really appreciate you all for supporting the channel. If you'd like to continue to support it, please consider becoming a member, and thank you very much to the channel members for supporting the channel. I really do appreciate it. And one last thing, I have uploaded a video to my second channel. Now, currently what's going to be on the second channel is basically re-uploads of my older content content that is now privated on the current channel. The main reason why is because I honestly feel like it's better for me to segment my content into certain things, and on my other channel is a retrospective on Black Ops 2 Zombies. So if you want to head over and watch that, it will be in the description alongside a bunch of other videos that will be coming out there in the next coming weeks. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a great night.